Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. The gap between rich and poor has never been wider. Legislative stalemate paralyzes the country. Corporations fight federal regulations at every turn. The influence of money in politics is greater than ever, and a dizzying array of inventions and innovations speeds the pace of daily life. Sound familiar? Well, those headlines from the early 1900s set the scene for Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book, The Bully Pulpit, a history of the first decade of the Progressive Era, when courageous journalists and an ambitious president took on the robber barons, the 1% of their day, and won. Goodwin tells the tale through the long friendship of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, a relationship that serves both until it ruptures in 1912, when they engage in a brutal fight for the presidential nomination that ends up crippling the progressive wing of the Republican Party and helps elect Woodrow Wilson. Getting equal billing, in her account, is the golden age of journalism led by the muckraking press at McClure's magazine. Together, a strong and progressive press and a strong and progressive president both serve the people of the U.S. rather than the super wealthy and the corporations. Let's see what lessons we can learn that might help us turn this country around a century later. Here on Freeform, we explore the lives and the work and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Doris Kearns Goodwin taught at Harvard University, worked as an assistant to President Lyndon Johnson during the last year in the White House, and later assisted Johnson on the preparation of his memoirs. She's the author of Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, the Pulitzer Prize-winning No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Home Front in World War II, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, and her latest, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. Welcome again, Doris Kearns Goodwin, to Freeform.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. Absolutely.
Great. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. So, as you did, I think it was now 7-8 years ago on Team of Rivals when you were last on, tell us a bit about how you see your personal path to the work that you do today. And mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision. Just set a scene for people so they know who's on the other end of this phone.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think in some ways my love of history goes back to when I was a little girl, both the fact that my father taught me how to keep score while listening to baseball games so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And that was history, even if only 4 or 5 hours old, and it makes you think pretty magic when your father listens to you forever.
Yeah.
And I had teachers in high school and college. My teacher in Long Island, New York, won an award as the best history teacher in New York State. And she made us feel like it was during the 50s, the civil rights movement beginning. Even when she talked about FDR dying, she almost cried because she had loved him so much. And then a similar magical teacher in college. So that was history, but it might have gone in a different direction for history had it not been for the fact that I ended up as a White House fellow to Lyndon Johnson and was able to work with him the last year of his presidency and then help him on his memoirs at the ranch the last years of his life. And somehow, at a vulnerable stage in his life, he talked to me in ways he never would have had I known him at the height of his power. And that's what set me off on my first biography on Lyndon Johnson. And I guess I've been studying dead presidents ever since.
Right. Here's one for you. The Bully Pulpit was released November 6th. My question to you is, was that the biggest event of that 7-day period for you? Or was it being present when the Red Sox won the World Series on October 31st?
No question the Red Sox winning the World Series was bigger. I mean, it is something. After I moved to Boston and after the Dodgers abandoned us and went to Los Angeles, I became an equally irrational Red Sox fan. And to be at the park, I mean, obviously when they won in 2004, after year after year after year of losing at the last minute, it was amazing in 2004. But there was something so special about this year, winning at home and being in the park. We went to all the playoff division. We have season tickets. And to be in that stadium that night when they won, it was, that was more exciting.
I love that. And what's interesting is when you say the park, in other words, everyone might think, she means the ballpark and so on. But you call it the park because this is Fenway Park. This is not Dodger Stadium. It's not sold its name to any corporation. It's not Safeco Field or something like that. This is the park.
Oh, wonderful. And it is as it was in almost 1912. So they've made some wonderful improvements in it, which is, I'm so glad that these owners didn't move it somewhere else and make it, something different. And you're right, some corporate-owned thing. So the seats may be tightly together in certain places. The bathrooms may not be great, but it's got all that history of a century, actually.
Yeah, that is the same park in which I saw my first Major League Baseball game, for sure.
Really? Oh, that's great.
Oh, sure. Well, I was in Cambridge from 65 to 73, and that was an era when the Bruins were winning the hockey championships, the Celtics were winning basketball championships, Harvard actually was winning football championships, and the Sox went to the series. That was the Lomborg, Yastrzemski, Jim Rice group.
Oh, exactly so. No, you were in the perfect time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, let me just tell people that we're doing this show about sports and baseball in Boston. I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with Doris Kearns Goodwin, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and we're going to talk about her latest bestseller, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. And you can learn more about all of that at DorisKearnsGoodwin, oneword.com. Okay, as you said, because of that really unique time that you spent with Lyndon Johnson, you found, and I think you said it could have gone a number of ways. History was going to be the thing, but would you be primarily a professor, or would you be writing about, moments and issues rather than people, if it hadn't been for that? But choosing as you do to write about prominent presidents, you are, because of the prominence of the subjects, FDR, Kennedy, Johnson, and so on, Lincoln, you're taking on subjects that are already well and often written about. How do you deal with that challenge, both when you're kind of navigating what will come next and also when you're in the process?
No, it's right. I mean, the reason I choose these people is that they are the most interesting people to write about, which is why so many other people have written about them. And usually the eras in which they lived, whether it's the Civil War or World War II or the 60s or now the Progressive Era, are dramatic moments in America's historical life. But then the huge problem with that is that you've got so many others that have already trod this path. And indeed, with Lincoln, 14,000 books have already written about him. So it's scary. It means that you have to know that it may take you a while to figure out the story you want to tell, and it probably will take longer to write it than a straight biography would, but it's worth it to be able to live with these giant figures. So each time I've had to try and find my own story. Instead of just writing about Franklin Roosevelt, I wrote about Franklin and Eleanor and the home front rather than the war front in World War II. When I got to Lincoln, I wrote about Lincoln and his internal team of rivals in the cabinet, so it was a cast of characters that meant like a quintuple biography instead of just Lincoln, but hoping that these other people would cast light on Lincoln, and they had all kept diaries and letters, so they were perfect for what you want as an historian. And here, too, I knew I wanted to write about Theodore Roosevelt, but there had been such wonderful recent biographies on him, it didn't make sense to just go over that ground again. So I started thinking about the fact that he was succeeded in 1908 by William Howard Taft, about which I knew very little, and that they then ran against each other in a bitter campaign in 1912. And as I started reading about their friendship, 400 letters exchanged between the two, that became another piece of this story. And then much later, when I realized that what differentiated the two as leaders was mostly that Roosevelt was a fabulous public leader and had remarkable relationships with the press, and Taft, as a judicial temperament person, never really knew how to deal with the press. That got me into the press and the muckrakers of that era. So then another 5 biographies came floating along. But in a certain sense, I think I'd like to believe you get the texture of a time. It's what you said at the very beginning. You get the texture of the times through the people. And if you have a cast of characters and you can make, hopefully, them come alive, you're seeing a movement like the progressive movement, not only from the president's point of view, but the journalist's point of view and several other people, so that they all bring a thread to the larger story.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and Team of Rivals, as you say, becomes almost a multiple biography, is that I think I've heard you say it, I've read it in a number of your interviews, that to you story is everything. The storytelling is what you're doing. And the thing that we know makes stories come to life is the relationships. To focus on one character and sort of how they take on the world, that's one thing, but it's in the way that a person becomes a different person with different relationships, or how relationships change people and people change relationships, is really, it seems to me, the stuff that really brings stories to life.
No question, I think. I mean, I think, history in a certain sense is about telling stories about people who lived before, about events in the past that create the contours of the present, and you have to hope that by studying the struggles and the triumphs of the people who lived before, you can learn something from them. And I think if only history could only be taught as a series of stories, I can't imagine why everybody should love history, because it just means other people living in another time with conflict and drama and sadness and triumph, instead of just having to just study eras that are abstract. If you can study the people inside of them, then you're willing to go with them to the policies they're dealing with and the more complicated parts of what's happening in that time, because you care about the people themselves.
That's right. I think that makes very good sense. Once I care about a person, then I look at what's pressing on them, how they respond to it, and it does take it out of the abstract. You knew you were thinking about writing. You were at least looking toward Roosevelt and that progressive era. You once taught a seminar on the progressives. I'm curious where and when, and how did your students respond to those ideas at the time, given the time you were teaching it?
Well, this would have been when I was just coming out of graduate school, so we're talking about maybe late 60s, early 70s. So we had just had a decade of activism when people felt like they were part of a larger struggle to make America a better place, the civil rights movement, people joining the Peace Corps, the war on poverty. So the progressive era probably felt pretty familiar to them then. And I remember there was a real interest in the idea of finding another period when government had a positive force upon the country. And so for me, it was. I think when I did this seminar, I also went into the New Deal. So it was progressives, and probably the 60s even weighed into it, just because we had been living through them. But that's probably what drew me back to this era, too. If I had to live during a time, I'd much rather live in one of these activist eras where people feel like their lives are larger than their own private lives because they're involved in what their country is doing, rather than just living in the 70s or the 20s, or the 1870s or the 1880s. I mean, these are the eras that, as FDR later said, some generations have a rendezvous with destiny. And I think people living at the turn of the 20th century, when the progressive movement took on the problems of the Gilded Age, felt that way as well.
Very good. This is Free Forum. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of a number of wonderful history books that focus on Lincoln, FDR and Eleanor, etc. And we're talking about the work in her latest bestseller, which it already is, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore, Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. And you can learn more at doriskearnsgoodwin.com. Okay, now I'm going to ask you, you sort of talked about it, but how do you research these books? And I'm thinking about the early stages. Like, how much do you research early accounts, journalism, letters, journals, and so on, before you found the stories?
Yeah, it's really the most important question, and sometimes it comes quicker than others. I mean, first, obviously, you're going to read the best books you can about the era or the person. And luckily, when you've been in history a long time, as I am, you know your fellow historians, so you know which books you should go to. So the beginning is that wonderfully pleasurable time when you're just reading, for pleasure and for learning. But then as soon as I can, when I have even an inkling of what the story is going to be, you want to get to those primary sources, because otherwise you'll feel like, how am I ever going to master this if I'm just reading the other people who've done this? You need your own way into it. So letters and diaries right away. I mean, for example, with Lincoln, it took me a couple years, actually, before I decided that I wanted to write about the team of rivals, because I thought I would do Abe and Mary as I had done Franklin and Eleanor. So I did a lot of research on the two of them and their relationship, but I realized that Mary couldn't carry the public side of the story, of course, the way Eleanor could, and I didn't just want to write about their marriage. This one, for some reason, early on, and I almost can't reconstruct it, I realized not only did I want to do Taft, but I wanted to do the muckrakers, so that meant right away I was reading the 400 letters between Teddy and Taft. Early on, I was going to Allegheny to figure out Ida Tarbell, one of the great muckrakers. Papers are there. Ray Baker, another muckraker, was at the Library of Congress, as was William Allen White. And Lincoln Steffens, another great character, was in New York. So if you just can feel like you know they're going to be your characters, as soon as you know that, even if you're not sure how the story is going to go, you want to get as many primary sources so you have their voices. Because I think part of what, well, you know this as a playwright, voice is so important that you want to be able to have their voices in the work as much as possible, not me talking, but them, and the extent to which you can find what they themselves are saying in these letters or diaries or journals or newspaper articles, then they give texture to the times because of their voices. Each of one is different. They all talk differently. They write differently.
Yeah, I think what someone might be surprised if they haven't read one of your histories before is, as I look at a page or a paragraph, what I see is your own connecting descriptions. This is the time, this is the moment, we're here at this part of New York at this moment. But you sprinkle it with so many actual quotations from the individuals themselves, from observers of the time, and I'm sure you can quote a speech, a letter, a journal. Those are all legitimate quotes, so that what you get is very much different from if one didn't rely as much as you do on the quotations and getting the voices. How did that style evolve?
Well, I think, when you read even like newspaper clippings from the old days, it just seems crazy to not actually use their words. These guys are at a speech or they're at an event, and you could, paraphrase them and you could figure out how to say it in your words. But for me, except for clogging up the book, with so much stuff at the end where you're talking about where it comes from, it's really worth it to have them talking instead of me. So that, the analysis has to be yours, the story structure has to be yours, and overall story is yours, but I love being able to use what the people at the time actually say, because obviously you can't make it up. That's the place where, fiction, it wouldn't be as good as the actual history of what the people are saying and thinking at the time.
Right. When I teach storytelling, which I do, I always say that whenever you can actually, I'm talking to, let's say, an organization, a nonprofit, a foundation about how to, tell their story, whenever you can actually have two human beings have an exchange of dialogue, people listen differently. It shifts where you hear it.
I absolutely agree with you. I think here you're asking people, in this case, to go back with me to 1890, 1900, 1910, which means it's a leap of being catapulted back into the past. And to the extent that my voice would be constantly there as a present voice, even though it's there underlying, hopefully, the whole time, but if they start caring about the people I'm writing about, they want to hear how they talked, and they all talk differently.
Yeah.
McClure, the founder of McClure's, in this kind of staccato voice, and Teddy, of course, with his fiery language, and Taft talking as a more like a judge. And after a while, even if you didn't see Taft said or Teddy said, hopefully you'd know who it was that was talking, because you get used to their method of expression. Yeah.
No, just as one would in a screenplay. You can often, once you're reading a screenplay or than watching on television, watching it in the movie theater or on television, you can begin to skip completely who's saying what because you begin to recognize it. The book is 910 pages. Oh, people just got scared, of which the last 158 are footnotes. So first question, did you set out to write a 750-page book? And in this day and age of 140-character tweets, are you or your publisher or anyone concerned that that's too long?
Well, I think what happens is, of course, it would have been great if I'd ended up telling the story in 300 pages, but I don't think I could have done that. So, yes, it is fat, and I think, however, once you get into a story, if you care about it, it's a little bit less fat than Lincoln was. So,
I didn't even realize that.
Oh, yes. I think it's definitely shorter pages, and it's a little thinner, and I know Lincoln did fine, so I have hope that people are accustomed to the fact that I don't write short books. I don't write them very often, and that hopefully once they get into it, it can be their companion for a long period of time. Just a matter of picking the thing up and putting it down, which can be a pain in the neck. Sometimes
you're saying merely by its heft.
Yeah, just by its heft. I used to tease that people would have to carry it around, with a roller bag in the airport.
Right.
But there's always, you can always put it on a Kindle if you want to, but meanwhile, I think it does become, I hope, when people care about the story, they want it to stretch out because then they really get absorbed in it. And the best compliment you can ever have is that somebody hoped it wouldn't end.
Right.
And if the story doesn't interest you, then it is too fat. If it does, it doesn't matter how fat it is or how thin it is. If the story isn't good, it doesn't matter.
And I would think one of the things with a period book, and I was almost going to say period fiction because this is so much about story, but with a period book, I think that's almost more so because once you have started spending a certain amount of time each day in this period, then it's really a question of when you put the book down, you go back into the present. When you pick it up, you're back into that period, and so at a certain point, you're going to leave that period. Not just the characters.
No, I think that's right. So anyway, luckily it worked for Lincoln, and hopefully it will for these characters.
I don't know whether you know this, but I looked up this morning. Bully Pulpit is number 10 bestseller on Amazon.
Well, that's pretty good. And I know it's going to be on the New York Times
next week, I think.
Next week.
Yeah,
too. So
but Amazon is the one we know that's the real numbers. There's no fudge in there. That's just the number. And so that, to me, I knew it would be in there somewhere. But for a book that's only been out a week and is as we say this size, this serious, and so on, to be number 10.
Thank you. I did not know that, so that's great to know.
Good. Okay. And then let's talk just a little bit about 158 pages of footnotes. In a bestseller, that strikes me as pretty unusual. I'm sure we could do some checking and find how many times that's happened. What you're doing there is you're noting every time you use one of those quotes, every time, so someone just understands what that process is.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, because I think for fellow historians, it may not be for the general reader that's important, but for fellow historians who may want to use that quote or may want to rely on it later, you can see it took place in a particular newspaper on a particular day, and it may have mattered when it was. So that I think you're talking to your fellow historians more even than the general public with those, but I know I rely on them so much when I read works of history, and a lot of my fellow narrative historians have these huge things as well. So, I wish they could have miniaturized it a little more, and then it would have taken up less pages, but I'm glad it's there.
Oh, it is miniaturized, though. Yeah,
it is miniaturized. Maybe even more. Maybe I was thinking maybe they could put a little, glass thing that you could have and just look at it that way.
Right. I know I saw a book just recently that put the footnotes online rather than in the book.
Yes, no, I know. Some of my fellow historians have done that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what will happen in the future.
In the next one, yeah. Another 6 years from now or whatever.
Well, no, hopefully I won't be taking that long anymore, but it was great fun to spend these last years with this. I really loved the process.
Oh, that's right. You go into the period and then have to leave it as well.
That's right. No, each time I finish one of these books, there is the sadness of moving. I have to move my books, the Lincoln books, into another room and make room for the Teddy Roosevelt books. Now I'll have to move the Teddy Roosevelt books, and you almost feel like you're betraying the president that you lived with for such a long period of time. And you do have to just rent yourself from one to the other. The Lincoln, obviously, even as I was writing Teddy, because the Spielberg movie came out, I was still living with Lincoln for part of that time with Teddy, and maybe I'll never leave Lincoln. I mean, there's something about him.
Yeah.
But by and large, it was Teddy and Taft that occupied my mind these last 7 years.
Yeah, that's the voice of Doris Kearns Goodwin. We're talking about her new best-selling book, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore, Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. I'm Terrence McNally. This is Free Forum. Let's talk about the primary characters. We've mentioned most of them. So the first one, of course, is Roosevelt. Roosevelt was bigger than life, a force of nature. How did that persona evolve?
You know, I think partly he had some sort of internal fire that is hard to explain. You're born with a desire to really exercise your talents and become a big figure. He was born with a life-threatening asthma, and he read so much as a little kid. He couldn't participate in physical activities until at one point his father worried that he was becoming an invalid and too timid and said, "You have the mind, Theodore, but not the body. You must make your body." And then he went into this incredibly manic phase of working out and becoming strong and eventually boxing, wrestling, all this, bear hunting, everything we know about him. And I think probably that physical exercise then only magnified the internal energy that he already had. But then what happened is, I think what made him so interesting and colorful to the people in his generation was the fact that he was interested in so many things. You often think of a politician rather narrowly. Here's a guy who's a world-class bird observer. He loves hunting game, in Africa later, and in bear hunts during the time he was president. He loves reading. I mean, he had a book with him at every moment. He said their companions once met are never lost. He loved football. He loved poetry. He loved bushwhacking. He just read so widely. He loved history that you could feel, whoever you were, that he was interested in your interest. And that's not usual for a politician.
Now, often such characters, I'm talking about the testosterone-driven, bigger-than-life characters, whether politicians or, leaders of industry or whatever, at a certain point seem opportunistic and inauthentic. As best as you can learn, was Roosevelt more authentic than that stereotype?
That's interesting. I think so in some ways. I mean, I think he was who he was. I mean, he loved being in the center of everything, which people understood about him, even as they made fun of him. I mean, his daughter Alice said he wanted to be the bride at the wedding and the baby at the baptism and the corpse at the funeral. And it becomes a problem later, actually, in 1912, when he can't bear being away from the political scene anymore, so he comes back and runs against Taft. Had he waited 4 more years, he would have won without a question, but he needed it. But that was all part of his authenticity. I don't think people ever felt, I hadn't thought about that, but I don't think they ever felt that he wasn't authentic. They may have thought he was egotistic and full of, fire and life, but not that. Yes, he was authentic.
Okay, now he was also born and brought up in a certain amount of wealth. What did the Roosevelt family fortune come from? How wealthy were they? And how did his progressive vision evolve from those roots?
Well, what happened is his grandfather was in real estate in New York and thus was quite very wealthy. Some of that money is passed down to his father, but his father wasn't really interested in business, so he became essentially a philanthropist and was interested in social justice. So that's where the young Teddy, the father had some newsboy lodging places. He cared about the Museum of Natural History, actually was one of the founders of it, and had a range of interests that just were not involved in business. So it left his father died, however, when he was a sophomore at Harvard, which was devastating to him. He loved this father. So money came to Teddy in a trust, but not tons of money. And he invested it after his first young wife died and his mother died on the same day in the same house in New York.
Oh, my God, yeah.
The child dying, the wife dying of childbirth and the mother of a sudden onset of typhoid fever. He went to the Badlands, and he invested his money in a ranch, at least half of his money, and he lost it eventually. So he didn't really have a big foundation under him for the rest of his life. He had to worry about making money to keep the lifestyle he had. Now, the lifestyle includes people living in the house that are servants, a beautiful house at Sagamore Hill, but he had to keep writing and speaking in order to keep that lifestyle going. So the wealth had dwindled to some extent by the time he gets to be a man.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now to do something that I know I didn't do on Lincoln, but you open the book with Roosevelt's return to the U.S. after a year abroad, most of it spent out of the limelight in Africa. You paint that picture, which seems to me a wonderful mix of modern aspects, that is to say current-day aspects of celebrity and mass appeal, with the slower, simpler ways, people having to come by train, people having to, just the way the news is delivered and the way if someone wants to be in Washington for that, they've got to plan a long time in advance and so on, the simpler ways of being in the early 20th century. Two questions. One, why do you start there? And then two, can you paint a little of that picture so people get a sense of when they enter this book where they're entering?
I think the reason I wanted to start there was I think sometimes if you start way back, with Teddy being born and Taft being born, you're not aware of what the story is that I eventually want to tell. But by choosing this one day when Teddy comes home from Africa, 1 million people in New York are waiting to greet him. Incredible. I mean, it's an ex-president, and they were so excited to see this man, showed his immense popularity. I mean, there were banners hung everywhere. Teddy bears were all over the place. Of course, the teddy bear having been named about him. People took the day off from work to see him. The cheers were enormous. And then I contrasted that with the fact that Taft, who's then president, had gone out to give a series of speeches that day, and it was hot where he was, whereas Teddy always had luck with the weather. So it only rained when he went inside. It was sunny when he was outside, and Taft was about to give a commencement speech, and it rained. And he was anxious, knowing that Teddy was coming home, and there was already a beginning of rupture. So because Taft, according to Teddy, might not have been as progressive as he thought he was, and so he was already beginning to feel some distance from this man he had put into the presidency, and Taft was worried about it. So I was able then to set the scene that these two people had been friends, and here's this day when they're both going in different directions, and no one knows what's going to happen with this friendship and with this rupture that's beginning to show. So then when you go back through the book in a more chronological way, with Teddy's youth and Taft's youth and the friendship developing and eventually falling apart, you know the stakes as you're going through it.
Yeah, very good. No, I often, when I'm talking to people about story, say that chronology is you'll have to deal with it at some point, but if you can plunge people into the middle of your story to begin with, it's a much more powerful way to grab them.
And indeed, I tried to do that with Lincoln as well. I started with 1860 and the four people hoping they were getting the Republican nomination,
right.
Lincoln and Chase and Seward and Bates, and knowing that somehow one of them was going to win, and then went back to tell their life story. I think it hopefully gives the reader a sense of where the story is going to go, even though you're just doing it in sort of, big, bold strokes at the very beginning.
Yeah, like I say, throwing them into a scene, and now they've got to figure out where am I, and then you'll pull the strands of that scene apart for them after that. No, I really appreciate that. That's the voice of Doris Kearns Goodwin. I'm Terrence McNally. This is Freeform. We're talking about her latest bestseller, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. You can learn more at DorisKearnsGoodwin.com. Okay, let's talk about William Howard Taft. Who was he?
Well, he turned out to be a more interesting fellow than I thought. I mean, I knew so little about him, just that he had been president in 08, lost in the 12, and eventually became Chief Justice of the United States, and that he was fat. That's probably what we both know. And in fact, it was interesting. His weight differed depending on the happiness and frame of mind that he was in. When he was at Yale as a college student, he weighed 250, which was okay for his build. When he finally got to the Supreme Court, the last decade of his life, he weighed 250. But in between, when he'd get anxious or unhappy, it went up to 350. But it turned out he came from a really fine family in Cincinnati. His father was a judge, also interested in social justice, as was Teddy's father. And his whole dream really was to become a judge. He was a judge, but then he eventually got to be Solicitor General in Washington, thinking that would be a step toward another higher judgeship. But while he was there, he met Teddy Roosevelt. They became young friends. They were both new reformers at a time when most people in the Republican Party were not. And William Howard Taft had an extraordinarily interesting wife named Nellie, who always wanted him to be in politics rather than the judicial life. She thought politics was more broadening. And so she helped to spur him on. After the Solicitor Generalship, he became Governor General of the Philippines, where he did quite an extraordinary job at a very difficult situation, occupying the Philippines. And he's very amiable, kindly. Teddy says of him, I envy his personality. Everybody likes him at first sight, whereas it takes longer to like me. But he had a certain kind of lack of love for politics, which was the problem. If you don't have that fire within and you don't have that desire to be in the spotlight, he was the perfect number two person. Secretary of War under Teddy did a great job. When Teddy would travel away to do his bear hunts or his train trips, he left Taft as acting president and said everything will be all right. He's sitting on the lid. But then once he wins that election, with Teddy's help, then he felt like a fish out of water because he had never really had that internal fire. And politics is so hard. Anyway, if you don't have that internal fire, it's going to be disastrous.
And it seems interesting that Teddy couldn't see that.
It does to me, too. I mean, it's very interesting because you would have seen signs of it, that except that when he had to give a speech for Teddy, and, on the 1904 election, presidents weren't supposed to campaign in their own right in those days, so he'd be out on the campaign trail talking for Teddy. Then he was better suited for that than talking about himself. But he would have seen times when he just didn't want to be out there, when he didn't like fighting, but somehow I guess he was just taken with Taft's personality, and he saw the things in Taft that weren't in himself, that everybody liked him. But that, you're right, that's a mystery to me too, because he was discerning about people. He should have realized that this was not what Taft wanted, or more importantly, Taft should have realized.
That's right.
Because Teddy offered him 3 times the job on the Supreme Court. Twice he was in the Philippines because Teddy wanted him to have what he wanted,
right,
and he didn't want to leave the Philippines. He felt duty-bound. The 3rd time, he was at a crossroads where people were talking about him as a potential presidential candidate, and he went a long time making the decision, took that fateful decision to decide to go for the presidency. Had he gone for the court back then, he would have been a lot happier man.
Well, but we may have Helen to blame for that, right?
Possibly, yes. I think his wife and his brothers really thought he was a big figure and could be even bigger as president than on the court. And they certainly steered him in that direction. But in the end, he has to take responsibility for making the decision.
What's interesting, actually, about him is that he marries and befriends 2 people who are more outgoing, in some ways more ambitious than he is, and rides that tide.
That's exactly right. No, that's right. His wife and Teddy Roosevelt, push him to a place where they want him to go.
Right.
They think he'll be right for that place, but unless, as I said before, unless you want to be there,
yeah,
it's not an easy thing to be in public life, in political life, at any time, much less back then.
And much less following Teddy Roosevelt.
It would have been hard for anybody.
Exactly.
In fact, not only following this colorful character, but by the time Taft took over the presidency, there was already a beginning rupture within the Republican Party. The progressives have gotten stronger. The conservative old guard was still in the Congress in the powerful positions. Teddy hadn't transformed the party. What he'd been able to do is by his relationships with the press, who wrote stories about Standard Oil and railroad abuses and the meatpacking plants and the corruption in the cities, they got the country so activist that it forced these congressmen to bring these bills to the floor. They would have easily kept them in committees, but he hadn't changed them. But then more of these young progressives were coming in, so even Teddy, if he'd been president in 1908, again, for what would have amounted to almost a 3rd term, would have had a hard time holding the 2 wings of the party together. Taft, of course, not being a public leader, had no chance of doing it.
Okay, let's talk about the press. The other key characters in the Bully Pulpit are the progressive journalists, the muckrakers. What is it that is different or unique about that moment that brings them to prominence, besides the individual S.S. McClure?
Well, I think there was a sense among that generation of journalists that they had a mission and a call. They were part of this movement. It wasn't just the press or the politicians. Churches were active in trying to deal with the aspects of industrialization that needed softening. The academic universities were involved in it. You had the settlement house situations. So it was one of those times when the country as a whole was dealing with the big problem that had been bequeathed them by the industrial age. And the journalists felt this sense that they had something that they wanted to do for their, for their time and their age. And they all do happen, as I know, to be there at that one magazine. But at McClure's magazine, besides the legendary journalists who are there, once they make their mark, then other journals, Collier's, et cetera, follow suit. So you have a whole group of journalists, and it's the age of the reporter. Before the 20th century, the most famous people who were journalists were editors, because you had partisan press, so you're an editor of the Republican paper or the Whig paper or the Democratic paper. Now you suddenly have national newspapers and national magazines, and reporting becomes, like one of my guys on McClure's took one of the early courses in journalism, and it was called rapid writing, which is what journalism was, rapid writing. I love that. I somehow think I missed that course somewhere along the line.
Just so people know, just quickly, each of the four of the big journalists that you focus on, Ida Tarbell, Ray Baker, Lincoln Steffens, and William Allen White, just a quick note about who they were and what their issue was.
Absolutely. And I mean, what the founder of the magazine allowed each of these journalists to do was he would give them huge expense accounts and time. They could sometimes work on their stories for 2 years before publishing a word, and then would publish a 12-part series month after month after month. Ida Tarbell essentially wrote the story about how Standard Oil had, by unfair means, become a monopoly. She'd actually had personal experience of that because her father had been an independent oil producer in Pennsylvania, undone when the octopus Standard Oil came in. And so powerful was her story that it led to the first corporation rule regulation in the Congress, and eventually used as the Justice Department's brief on breaking up Standard Oil. Ray Baker made railroad abuses his own story, and he showed how they priced things in such a way that the trusts or the monopolies had all the advantages and small business didn't, and his stories became so much a part of the common conversation. Roosevelt then wanted proofs of his stories ahead of time, sent Ray Baker proofs of his messages ahead of time, and they got regulation of railroads for the first time. Lincoln Steffens went out to the cities and studied the corruption of the political bosses in the cities, some of whom ended up going to jail as a result of his stories. New mayors would be elected, progressive mayors, and he became, a legendary figure in his own time. William Allen White was incredible because he's living in Emporia, Kansas the whole time, and he's a country editor, but he has a national following because he's got a folksy language, and he is himself eventually a progressive, and he writes short stories and books and becomes probably the most quoted country editor of all. But most importantly, they all were comrades. They read each other's work, they become friends, and really developed a tie that I think strengthened all of their works, which interdisciplinary worked for each other.
Yeah, no, that's really something. You talk actually about how this was a time when collaborative systems sort of emerged, and your book is full of them, whether it's the corporations and their excesses or the collaboration of Taft and Roosevelt or the collaboration within McClure. It's an interesting dynamic of the time. I want to jump to the present now. We'll do it later, sort of comparing Obama and Roosevelt, but right now the press of that day and the press of today. Who do you see carrying on that tradition today? Some names that I thought of were, is that Eric Schlosser? Is it Bill Moyers? Is it Matt Taibbi? Is it Mother Jones?
I think those people are all in that tradition in trying to use the forum of journalism to produce progressive change in the country. I think the hardest thing now is the attention span of our public. I mean, in those days, as Ray Baker marveled, they would write 20 or 30,000 word articles, and the people would gobble them up and talk about them and pass them around from one person to another, and they would focus on them. You just didn't have what we have today. You might get one of these hard-hitting journalist pieces, and then the next thing you know, there's some other breaking story 2 minutes later, or the journalists themselves are caught between, blogging and Facebook and Internet and television, and how many of them really do have that luxury of somebody supporting them for several years to do an article or a series of articles in a magazine. So I think it's harder, but the tradition never dies, and there's obviously people that are part of it now.
Well, what about, I'm going to ask you about Pierre Omidyar's NUCO. Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill, Laura Poitras, Eric Bates, formerly editor at Rolling Stone, Dan Frumkin, Lillian Segura. In an article about it by Jeffrey Rosen, he quotes, "You start with individual journalists who have their own reputations, deep subject matter expertise, clear points of view, an independent and outsider spirit, a dedicated online following, and their own way of working." Sounds a lot like McClure's.
Sure does. In fact, that's great to hear. You know more about this than I do, so I will search into this. I'm really glad to hear that. That's a very positive thought.
Very good. And you know who I'm talking about, right? One of the founders of eBay, and he says he's going to put $250 million into this. So,
which is a lot larger than 400,000 that were reading McClure's at the time.
Exactly. Exactly. Great. This is Free Forum. I'm Terrence McNally, speaking with Doris Kearns Goodwin, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. We're talking about her latest bestseller, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. You can learn more at DorisKearnsGoodwin.com. Okay. Talk just a bit about the election campaign of 2012 and how these former close friends, longtime close friends, end up fighting and painting each other as unworthy choices.
I think what happened is, in order to get through the kind of difficulty of turning against a friend, they each had to believe that the other person was really a danger to the republic in a certain sense. So Teddy Roosevelt was more fiery in his language about Taft than vice versa, but incredibly calling him a fathead with the brain of a guinea pig, even though he'd relied on him so much in office, that he was completely enthralled by the special interests, had turned himself over to the business community. And he knew at some level in himself that wasn't so, but as somebody said, the only way he could fight about somebody was when he had an adversary, he had to destroy him. So Taft, on the other hand, then began to believe internally that if Teddy got the third term, he'd have a fourth, he'd have a fifth, maybe he'd never leave office, and the whole separation of powers, which was part of our Constitution, would be at risk. And then, meanwhile, their followers became really intense against each other, making the current Republican Civil War seem slight compared to this. I mean, at the Republican Convention in Chicago in 1912, when they're both trying to get the party convention's nomination, if you saw a Teddy delegation in the hallway, they'd start fighting with a Taft delegation. They needed 1,000 policemen at the headquarters to ward off fights that they knew were going to happen. There was hissing and booing. It was really quite brutal and ugly. And then, of course, you knew right away if the Republican Party was going to split, especially once Teddy left after he lost the nomination, forms the third party, the Bull Moose Party, that the die is cast and that the Democrat Woodrow Wilson not only wins the presidency but the Congress and the Senate.
And what does that do to progressivism?
I think it hurt it. There's no question, because they weren't able to field a separate party and keep it going. So much of it had to do with Teddy Roosevelt's personality, and he wasn't willing to run in 1916. And obviously the people who were progressive stay there, and some of them remain in the Republican Party, as La Follette did, and they are still fighting the good fight. But they were at such a high point in 1912, although I guess you could argue that Woodrow Wilson, who had not started out as a progressive but hadn't been in public life very long, became more progressive and actually ran on a pretty progressive platform in 1912, and some of the legislation that the progressives in the Republican Party would have wanted got passed under Woodrow Wilson. So even though, the Democrats won and the Republicans lost, progressives won in 1912 big time. So, but the party itself never had that future that they thought they might have had in 1912.
Okay, let's turn to the present, reflected in the past. As both an advisor and a biographer of presidents, what lessons do you draw from Teddy Roosevelt that, let's say you were given the chance, you would offer Barack Obama so that he could more successfully deal with similar times, similar problems, inequality, squeezed middle class, corruption of money in politics, and a tough conservative opposition in Congress? What would Teddy, through you, say to Barack?
Well, I think, given that conservative opposition in Congress and the paralysis there, I mean, Teddy faced a similar situation, and he knew the only chance he had was to use the bully pulpit, which is he defined that word, meaning the national platform to educate the country, to move the country, to pressure the Congress from the outside in. And the question, I think, today is that bully pulpit still, as an institution, as powerful as it was? When Teddy's there, his speeches would be printed in full. He would command headlines, and you could focus on issues. By the time of Roosevelt, when the radio replaces, in some ways, the print medium as the major way people are listening to the news, his speeches on the radio, his fireside chats, are listened to by 80% of the audience. Saul Bellow said you could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night, not miss a word. Everybody was listening. Even in the early days of television, before cable, you had 3 networks. Everybody's listening fully up to Reagan, from JFK to Reagan. Now you might just listen to Barack Obama on your own station. It might be an excerpt rather than the full speech. The pundits are already tearing it down before he finishes. And then breaking news happens 2 days later anyway because of our attention span. So I still think, though, that developing a positive relationship as much as you can with the press and channeling your own ability as that national platform to be out in the country. Maybe they should go back on these train trips. There's something about talking to the people.
Well, that's after every convention they get on a bus and do it.
Yeah, but then you get caught up in Washington after that.
That's right.
During the campaigns they do it, and there's an energy you get from the people. But Teddy Roosevelt was doing it continually. I mean, he'd go for 6 weeks at a time on a train trip, stopping at the village stations. And he also learned, I think, could be a good thing for the president now, how to speak in simple, repetitive language. He had all those great slogans, speak softly and carry a big stick. The square deal absolutely fit the time. I'm going to not be against corporations as long as they do well, but I'm going to get them if they don't. I'm not against unions as long as they're fair, but I'm going to get them if they're not. And that's where the country was. But more importantly, he said at one time, my Harvard buddies think I talk in too folksy language and homely language, but I know it reaches the people. So he had figured out how to explain things really simply and then just repeat them over and over again. And I think that's something that the current presidents need to do as well.
2 questions about Obama. Roosevelt was clearly a progressive. Is it your sense that Obama is, or is he more of a centrist that takes the occasional progressive swing?
I think he came in pretty much as a progressive, and the interesting thing is that when you look back at even 1907, before he won, I remember seeing public opinion polls that showed that there was a greater understanding of the importance of the role of government. If we argue that part of progressivism at the turn of the 20th century was the recognition that public power was essential to solve some of the social and economic problems of the time, at a time when people believed the government had no right at all to be involved in the economy, that's what distinguished progressives. We want to deal with these problems and use public power, which could be state or local or federal government, to deal with it. I think Obama came in with that belief, and the country had that feeling behind it. And I'm not sure, when I look back, if I were to live 50 years from now, to try and sort out what happened. It's really still hard to figure out, how the country moved in a direction, especially now where people are so frustrated with the government and have lost their faith in government's power to do things. I mean, obviously the Health Care Act was a huge signature achievement of somebody who cared about progressive values. And it's all going to figure out if that gets worked out. It'll be one thing. If it doesn't, it'll be a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny not funny. It's so sad that someone who could have the absolutely state-of-the-art online presence and technology in his campaigns can have cost the nation so much by not being able to deliver when it actually matters, when it's not just about being elected, but when it's actually about implementing policy. That the online failure.
I wonder, is this bureaucracy we've created now so big?
Yeah.
But you'd think the web is something that could simplify it. It's just still a mystery to me.
Yeah, part of it, I think, is that if he had gone for Medicare for all and been able to pass it, I think the website would have been a heck of a lot simpler. But the jerry-rigged Rube Goldberg thing that he created to placate this part and that part and not go all the way this way or that way, I think created the challenge for the website. We've got about a half a minute. I'm just going to let you remark on what you ended your talk with the other day when I saw you at Live Talks LA. I think your final quote was quoting McClure, when he said there is no one left to fix the nation's problems, none but all of us.
And I think that's still true. I mean, we all sit around and complain about what's happening in Washington. People hate the idea that special interests have so much control, that money is such a huge part of politics these days. And somehow all of us can do something. I mean, there's constitutional amendment out there we could deal with about the power of money. And unless we get involved as citizens, it does seem, as McClure said, that there's no one left at this point but all of us.
Yeah, and as you point out, the progressive era had one Roosevelt who knew that he had to go over the heads of the conservative and laissez-faire Washington to the people to get things done. The later Roosevelt with the New Deal was the one who, when he gets into power, says, you've got to make me do it. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, no matter who's in office and what the times are.
Absolutely right.
Okay, so again, the book is Pulitzer Prize. The book is The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. And you can learn more at DorisKearnsGoodwin.com. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you so much. What fun to talk to you.
Oh, Thanks great. Keep up the good work. For this week's conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website if you want to get my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about. Sign up at my site or email me at temcnally @mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to Freeform podcast on iTunes. Thanks to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi in production, and you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week. My guest will be Jaron Lanier, one of the creators of virtual reality. We're going to talk about his new book, Who Owns the Future, in which he says we should all get a piece of the financial value of what we share on Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of the web. Twitter, which consists basically of our shares plus ads, is valued at $28 billion. He says we should all share in that wealth.